Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the disappearance of a 19-year-old girl after her prom, and the haunting discovery of her dress 36 years later that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The summer of 2023 was relentless, baking the fields of Lancaster, Ohio, under a hazy, unforgiving sun. On a sprawling tract of land where generations of corn had once grown, the past was being systematically erased. Timothy Walsh felt no particular sentiment about it. He was a demolition man, and his job was to dismantle history, not preserve it. His current target was an old, derelict barn, a skeletal structure that had sagged under the weight of nearly a century of changing seasons, its timber groaning a final protest against the inevitable. The air inside was a physical presence thick with the suffocating scent of dry rot, hay dust, and the ghosts of animals long gone. As his crowbar pried at the warped, splintering floorboards of the hayloft, the sound echoed in the cavernous silence. He wasn't looking for anything. He was simply clearing the way for the bulldozers. It was there, tucked away in the deepest shadows where the sun hadn't reached for decades, that his work came to an abrupt halt. It wasn't a box or a forgotten tool. It was a package, an anomaly in this place of decay, carefully wrapped in yellowing plastic sheeting and bound with twine that had grown brittle with age. An inexplicable curiosity, a feeling almost of trespassing, compelled him to stop. With hands calloused from destruction, he gently, almost reverently, unwrapped the strange bundle. The plastic crackled and tore, a sound loud as a gunshot in the stillness, releasing a faint, musty smell of time itself, and then a single beam of light, piercing through a crack in the roof, found it, a midnight blue prom dress. For a moment, Walsh could only stare. It was so profoundly out of place, a piece of a forgotten dream in a landscape of decay. Even in the dim, dusty light, it held a kind of magic. The delicate beadings scattered across the bodice caught the faint light, shimmering like a trapped constellation. It was a size 6, a relic of a bygone fashion, yet remarkably, almost supernaturally, preserved. Beneath the carefully folded dress lay a pair of silver high-heeled shoes, their faux leather cracking but the shape still elegant. And inside, a small matching evening purse was a final, chilling collection of artifacts, a tube of rose-pink lipstick, barely used, a ticket stub for a movie that had been in theaters that long ago spring, and a Millbrook High School student ID card, laminated and faded, but the smiling face was still achingly clear. The name printed below read Jessica Lynn Caldwell. It was a ghost from another time, another place, unearthed 50 miles from where she was last seen alive. A single object, a beautiful dress, suddenly imbued with the crushing weight of a 36-year-old mystery. It was a silent witness, finally ready to speak. How could a dress, the centerpiece of a young girl's perfect night, end up here, in this coffin of decaying wood? And why, after all this time, was it preserved with such deliberate, almost reverent care? The story of the dress does not begin in the suffocating dust of a forgotten barn. Its story begins 36 years earlier, under the wide, hopeful skies of a place that felt a world away. The spring of 1987 had settled over Millbrook, Ohio, like a warm, familiar blanket. This was a quintessential American small town, a farming community nestled between rolling hills and geometric seas of corn. A place where time was measured not by the frantic ticking of clocks, but by the patient cycle of planting and harvest. Main Street stretched for barely 6 blocks, a living diorama of family-owned businesses that had weathered decades of economic change: a hardware store, a diner with vinyl booths, a single-screen movie theater, and Henderson's Five and Dime. It was a place where keys were often left in car ignitions and screen doors were latched but never locked, a self-contained enclave of trust in a world that was rapidly changing beyond its borders. According to local police records from the era, violent crime was a statistical anomaly. Tragedy was something that happened elsewhere. A headline in a newspaper from Columbus or Cleveland. A story read with a distant, removed sympathy before being folded away with the classifieds. The social event of the year, the very heartbeat of this tranquil spring, was the Millbrook High School prom for the town's youth. It was a sacred rite of passage, a fairy tale night that marked the definitive, shimmering end of childhood and the beginning of everything else. The Millbrook Community Center, a humble brick building usually reserved for town meetings and farmers' markets, underwent its annual metamorphosis. Silver streamers and clusters of white balloons hung from the rafters, turning the mundane into the magical. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a specific, youthful alchemy, a blend of blooming apple blossoms carried on the gentle breeze, the sweet scent of corsages, and the raw, nervous energy of 200 teenagers dressed in their absolute finest. The soundtrack was a tapestry of synth pop and power ballads, the anthems of a generation on the cusp of the future. Yet, this idyllic scene was bordered by a quiet, unspoken reality. Just beyond the edge of town, a constant, humming presence, ran State Route 23. It was a major artery of central Ohio, a ribbon of asphalt that never slept, a dark river carrying a ceaseless flow of transient life, long-haul truckers in their roaring rigs, traveling salesmen in anonymous sedans, strangers with no names and no connection to the tight-knit world of Millbrook. The highway was both a lifeline and a potential threat, a conduit to the outside world that, on this particular night, would become an accomplice to a tragedy that would forever shatter the town's cherished innocence. It was a night poised on the knife's edge between fairy tale and nightmare, though no one inside that brightly lit hall yet knew it. And at the very center of this swirling galaxy of light and sound was Jessica Lynn Caldwell. At 19, Jessica was the living embodiment of Millbrook's promise. She possessed a radiance that seemed to come from within, a warmth that was entirely effortless. Her dark auburn hair caught the light as she moved, and her laugh, a genuine, uninhibited peal of joy, could be heard from across the crowded room. She was the pride of her parents, Robert and Linda, hard-working farmers who had instilled in her a sense of purpose and a quiet, unshakable determination. Every single penny she earned from a part-time job stocking shelves at Henderson's Five and Dime was being saved for tuition at Ohio University in the fall. Her acceptance letter was pinned to the corkboard in her bedroom, a daily reminder of the bigger life that awaited her. Her date was Tommy Brennan, the football team's star quarterback and her devoted boyfriend of 8 months, handsome, popular, and seemingly destined for a sports scholarship and a life of small-town glory. He was everything a girl could dream of. They were the golden couple, their future seemingly mapped out in the proud smiles of their friends and family. As they danced to a slow song, He whispered an inside joke in her ear, and her head fell back in that familiar, joyous laugh. For that moment, everything was perfect. For this night, her night. Jessica had chosen a gown that seemed woven from the midnight sky itself. She'd driven 40 miles to the Lazarus department store in Columbus to find it, spending weeks of saved wages on the midnight blue fabric and its star-like beading. It was more than a dress. It was a declaration of the woman she was becoming. When she had tried it on for her mother earlier that evening, a quiet, sacred moment in her sun-filled bedroom, Linda had tears in her eyes. "You look like a princess, sweetheart," she had whispered, her voice thick with love and a touch of melancholy, as she adjusted the thin straps on her daughter's shoulders. And she did. For a few precious hours, under the twinkling lights of the community center, Jessica was a princess, dancing in a protected kingdom where nothing could possibly go wrong. But beneath the surface of this perfect picture, a subtle, insidious dissonance had begun to hum. It started as a feminine pressure, a dull, persistent ache that anchored itself behind her eyes. At first, she dismissed it as a product of the sheer excitement, the stuffy air in the crowded hall. But it grew. The cloying mix of perfume, cologne, and warm spring air, once intoxicating, was now becoming overwhelming, making her feel dizzy and disconnected. The room, once magical, now felt constricting, its walls seeming to close in. The music, once a joyful pulse, now seemed to pound in time with the growing, rhythmic pressure in her head. It was a small, purely physical complaint, a common ailment that could happen to anyone. But in the intricate, fragile ecosystem of that specific night, this single, ordinary headache would become the portent of doom, the tiny, fateful pivot upon which an entire life and the soul of a town would tragically and irrevocably turn. The heavy glass doors of the community center swung shut behind them, muffling the vibrant pulse of the music to a dull, rhythmic thud that seemed to beat in time with the throbbing in Jessica's temples. The air in the parking lot was cooler, carrying the sweet, clean scent of the Ohio spring, but it offered little relief. The world outside the prom felt strangely muted and distant. The area was dimly lit by a single, humming street lamp that cast long, distorted shadows between the cars, turning the familiar space into an unnerving labyrinth of light and darkness. Other couples had the same idea. Their silhouettes scattered around the lot, hushed conversations and soft laughter drifting like fragments of a dream. Jessica leaned against the cool metal of Tommy's Pride and Joy, a red 1984 Camaro, trying to ground herself. "Are you feeling better?" Tommy asked, his voice a mixture of concern and a restless energy that was still tethered to the party inside. His arm was around her waist, a familiar comfort that now felt somehow insufficient against the strange malaise that had claimed her. She nodded, a weak gesture that failed to convince either of them. Her face, in the sallow yellow light, was pale, her usual radiance dimmed. "Maybe we should just skip the after party," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I just want to go home." A frown creased Tommy's brow. According to later interviews with his friends, he'd been talking about the after party at Jake Morrison's farm for weeks. It was the unofficial, unsupervised climax to their high school careers, a final night of freedom before the realities of adulthood set in. His teammates were expecting him. "Come on, Jess, it's prom night," he pleaded, his tone shifting from concern to persuasion. "We can't miss Jake's party. It'll be fun. It'll take your mind off your headache." "I really don't feel well, Tommy," she insisted, a new firmness in her voice. "My head is absolutely pounding. What followed was a quiet, tense negotiation. The kind of friction common to any young couple, but which, in hindsight, would be scrutinized with the weight of a criminal investigation. Their voices were low, almost inaudible over the music still bleeding from the building, but their body language spoke volumes. Other students, in their post-event statements to police, would recall seeing them by the car. But no one paid much attention. It was just Jessica and Tommy, having a minor squabble. It was normal. It was forgettable. Finally, after several minutes of this tense back and forth, Jessica made the decision. It was a simple declaration of independence that would, in the most tragic way imaginable, grant her a final horrifying autonomy. "You go to the party," she said, pulling away from his embrace, creating a small but significant space between them. "I'll find another way home." "Don't be ridiculous. Jess, I'm not leaving you here," he countered, a flash of frustration in his eyes. "Amy can give me a ride, or I'll call my dad. It's fine. Just go." She was already turning away from him, her silver heels making a stark, lonely sound on the asphalt, a lonely metronome clicking away the final seconds of her known existence. Tommy called after her, his voice a sharp note of protest in the night, but Jessica did look back. She disappeared around the hard brick corner of the building, heading back toward the main entrance, swallowed by the shadows. That was the last time anyone ever saw her alive. The first hint of dawn on May 17th arrived not with warmth, but with a strange, unnerving chill. Linda Caldwell was an early riser, her life governed by the rhythms of the farm. She woke expecting to hear the soft sounds of her daughter moving about, or perhaps to find her still asleep, still wearing the magnificent blue dress as she had after homecoming months before. Instead, she was met with a profound and unnatural silence. She found Jessica's bed untouched. The covers were still turned down from the previous morning, the pillow undented. A wave of cold dread, primal and immediate, washed over her. She moved through the quiet house, a frantic checklist of possibilities running through her mind. Perhaps she'd stayed at Amy's. Perhaps she and Tommy had made up and gone for an early breakfast. But the evidence on the kitchen counter refuted every hopeful theory. Jessica's purse was there, sitting where she always left it. Her car keys were beside it, and the front door was unlocked. The Caldwell family's world, so solid and predictable just hours before, collapsed into a black hole of terror. The frantic phone calls began first to Amy, who sleepily reported that she'd assumed Jessica had left with Tommy, then to Tommy, who's confused, then panicked. Voice confirmed he'd gone to the party alone. By noon, the carefully constructed piece of Millbrook had been shattered. Half the town was organized into search parties, a grim parade of farmers and neighbors combing through the whispering cornfields and dense woods that bordered the Caldwell property. Their calls of Jessica were swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. The Ohio State Highway Patrol was called in, followed by seasoned investigators from the county sheriff's department. The case was assigned to Detective Ray Hutchinson, a 20-year veteran with kind, weary eyes who specialized into the delicate, heartbreaking cases involving young people. As he sat in the Caldwell's living room, surrounded by smiling family photos that now felt like exhibits in a memorial, he laid out the grim possibilities. "In my experience," he told Robert and Linda, his voice gentle but firm, "when a young person goes missing after a social event like this, there are usually 3 scenarios. They ran away, They met with an accident, or someone took them. Jessica wouldn't run away, Linda stated, her hands gripping her husband's so tightly her knuckles were white. She had college starting. She was excited. And she wouldn't have left without her car or her purse, Robert added, his voice raw from a morning spent shouting his daughter's name into the wind. Hutchinson had already arrived at the same conclusion. This was not a runaway. This was something else. The investigation immediately zeroed in on the critical window of time between approximately 10:30 p.m., when Jessica walked away from Tommy Brennan, and 6:00 a.m., when her absence was discovered. Logically and statistically, the focus fell squarely on one person. Young men were the most likely perpetrators in cases involving missing girlfriends, and their argument had been witnessed. Tommy Brennan became the first and most obvious suspect. The pressure on the 18-year-old was immense and immediate. He was interviewed for hours, his story dissected and re-examined from every angle. His account remained painfully consistent. Jessica had walked away from him. He'd assumed she was going back inside to find another ride, and he had left for the party. "I should have gone after her," he repeated, the words choked by tears, during one of many interviews. His youthful face, a mask of grief and a guilt that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "I should have made sure she got home safe. I'll never forgive myself." But as investigators dug deeper, a frustrating truth emerged. Tommy's alibi was solid. Dozens of classmates confirmed he had arrived at Jake's party alone before 11 p.m. More than that, there was photographic proof. Pictures developed from a disposable camera days later showed him in the background of several shots, his face clearly visible playing beer pong at midnight. A carefree teenager, unaware that his world was simultaneously falling apart. The timeline made it nearly impossible for him to have been involved. The exoneration of Tommy Brennan, however, did not bring relief. It brought a deeper, more terrifying mystery. If the person with the most obvious motive and opportunity hadn't done it, then who had? The circle of suspicion widened, transforming the familiar faces of the community into a gallery of potential threats. The investigation, which had started with a clear focus, now spiraled out into the terrifying unknown. And so, the questions hung in the thick, heavy air of that Ohio summer. The days began to bleed into one another, each one marked by a new, fruitless search and a deeper entrenchment of despair. Spring's hopeful green gave way to the oppressive heat of a summer filled with yellow ribbons tied around telephone poles and increasingly desperate press conferences. Hope, once a blazing fire that fueled the town's search efforts, began to dwindle, its embers slowly extinguished by the relentless, silent passage of time. Jessica's photograph, that radiant prom night smile, began its sad journey onto milk cartons and missing person posters, her face becoming a haunting, ubiquitous symbol of interrupted dreams. For the Caldwell family, the world had been permanently thrown off its axis. They were living in a surreal state of suspended grief, unable to mourn, yet unable to hope. Documents from the era, including local newspaper accounts, described the visible toll the ordeal took on them. Robert's hair, once peppered with gray, went completely white by that Christmas of 1987. Linda lost 30 pounds, her face taking on a hollow, haunted look that would never quite leave her. They existed in a torturous limbo, their lives now dedicated to a single, all-consuming purpose: finding answers. The town of Millbrook, once a bastion of innocence, was forced to confront a dark new reality. Parents held their children closer. Curfews were more strictly enforced. A collective anxiety settled over the community, a permanent scar left by the knowledge that evil was not an abstract concept from the city, but a tangible presence that could walk their quiet streets and steal one of their own. The most poignant symbol of this stolen future was the Millbrook High graduation ceremony, which the school had delayed by a week in the fragile hope that Jessica would be found. When the day finally arrived, an empty chair, draped in a midnight blue ribbon, sat among the rows of graduating seniors. As the principal called her name, Jessica Lynn Caldwell, a wave of sorrow rippled through the gymnasium, a sound of hundreds of hearts breaking at once. Her acceptance letter to Ohio University went unanswered. The life she had so meticulously planned, so eagerly anticipated, had simply stopped. Back at the farm, Linda Caldwell refused to change her daughter's bedroom. It was preserved exactly as Jessica had left it on the morning of May 16th, becoming less a room and more a shrine. Her prom corsage, now dried and brown, remained pinned to her dresser mirror. College brochures still sat in neat stacks on her desk, filled with promises of a future that would never be realized. Detective Hutchinson worked the case obsessively for months, his office walls covered with maps, timelines, and photographs of Jessica's smiling face. He followed every lead, no matter how flimsy, interviewing truckers, transients, and anyone who might have been passing through on Route 23 that night. But every path led to a dead end. There was no credible witness who saw her after she rounded that corner. There was no physical evidence. There was no ransom note. There was nothing. Jessica Lynn Caldwell had simply vanished into the night air. Years passed. The world moved on. But in Millbrook, time remained fractured. In 1995, after a long and distinguished career, Detective Ray Hutchinson retired. But he never truly left the case behind. He took boxes of Jessica's case files with him, a personal promise to Robert and Linda that he would never stop looking for answers. But with his official departure, the active investigation effectively ceased. The case of the missing prom queen of Millbrook officially went cold, becoming a cautionary tale whispered to new generations, a local ghost story whose chilling power came from the fact that it was all too real. A cold case is not dead. It is sleeping. It lies dormant in the back of filing cabinets, a collection of brittle papers and faded photographs, waiting for years. The case of Jessica Lynn Caldwell slept that deep, dreamless sleep. The 1990s gave way to a new millennium. Technology evolved at a breathtaking pace, offering tools that Detective Hutchinson could have only dreamed of: DNA databases, digital forensics, and interconnected law enforcement networks that could shrink the country in a matter of keystrokes. It was this new technological dawn that prompted the creation of specialized cold case units across the nation, teams of detectives dedicated to re-examining the ghosts of the past. In 2002, 15 years after Jessica's disappearance, her file, thick with old reports and dead-end leads, was assigned to Detective Maria Santos of the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Santos was of a new breed of investigator, meticulous, patient, and technologically fluent. She spent months digitizing every scrap of paper, building a searchable database from the mountain of old files, hoping the digital patterns would reveal something the analog world had missed. She cross-referenced Jessica's case with other disappearances, identifying a troubling pattern of young women vanishing from small towns along major highways in the late 1980s. A serial predator, she theorized, had been hunting along these corridors. But Jessica's case remained an outlier. Unlike the others, there was no crime scene, no physical evidence, nothing to test or reevaluate. It was a perfect void. The years continued to pass, turning the once raw wound of the community into a faded historical scar. Linda Caldwell passed away in 2009, taking 2 decades of unanswered questions to her grave. The case slept on until the summer of 2023. The call that reached Detective Santos, now a supervisor with the BCI, was the kind of call that every cold case detective dreams of and dreads in equal measure. A construction worker demolishing a barn in Lancaster had found something belonging to Jessica. When Santos arrived at the scene, the sight of the midnight blue prom dress laid out in an evidence bag struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was real. After 36 years of silence, a voice from the past was finally speaking. The dress was transported to the state crime lab, where it became the subject of an intense forensic examination. The results that came back were as baffling as they were horrifying. Forensic reports confirmed there were no obvious signs of a violent struggle. The fabric was not torn or ripped. There were no soil samples or biological evidence that would suggest it had been removed in a field or a forest. Most chillingly, the dress had been carefully cleaned before being wrapped and hidden. This was not the chaotic aftermath of a passionate crime. This was the deliberate, methodical work of a predator who had taken a trophy. The evidence suggested that Jessica had not been assaulted in the dress. Whoever had taken it had done so with a cold, calculated purpose, preserving it as a memento of their dark deed. The irrefutable evidence did not solve the mystery. It deepened it, twisting it into something even more psychologically disturbing. The dress told them what had been done with it. Now, Santos had to make the barn tell her who had put it there. The investigation now pivoted from forensics to a painstaking, almost archaeological, dig through public records. Santos and her team began tracing the ownership history of the barn property, a task complicated by decades of sales, transfers, and faded memories. They built a timeline, a reverse genealogy of the land itself. The breakthrough came when they unearthed a deed from 1987. The barn had belonged to a man named Carl Henderson. The name was instantly familiar, an echo from the earliest pages of the case file. It was the same Henderson family that had owned the Five and Dime where Jessica worked. Carl Henderson, who had died of a heart attack in 1991, was the grandfather of Jessica's boss. He had also been a long-haul trucker, his business based out of that very barn. His roots, investigators discovered, had regularly taken him up and down State Route 23 right through the heart of Millbrook, sifting through a box of his old business effects. They found a gas station receipt. The small, faded piece of paper was a lightning bolt from the past. It was from Murphy's Gas on Main Street in Millbrook, time-stamped at 9:45 p.m. Stones. On May 16th, 1987, just 45 minutes before Jessica was last seen. Carl Henderson had been there. He had been a ghost, hiding in plain sight in the case file for 36 years. The focus of the investigation shifted entirely to this dead man. They built a profile of a loner, a man who spent his life on the anonymous highways of the Midwest. The final piece of the puzzle, however, lay not in old records, but in the fragile, fragmented memory of a living person. Investigators located Carl's son, David Henderson, now a man in his 70s, living in a nursing home. His mind clouded by the early stages of dementia. The interview process was delicate. Detective Santos, accompanied by a specialist in interviewing individuals with memory impairments, gently probed David's recollections of his father. For a long time, he remembered little of that specific period, but during a second interview, as Santos asked about his father's work routines, David made a comment that stopped the detective cold. He said it casually, as if commenting on the weather. Dad always said he never hurt that girl, David mentioned, his eyes looking at something far away. Said people would think the worst, but he never hurt her. Santos felt her heart rate accelerate. Her voice remained calm, steady. What girl? David, which girl are you talking about? David looked confused for a moment, his mind struggling to grasp the thread. He shook his head. I don't know. Something about a dress. Dad always worried about that dress. Over several more sessions, a horrifying story began to emerge, pieced together from the shattered fragments of David Henderson's memory. It was not a confession in the legal sense, but a series of recalled conversations of his father's troubled ramblings in the years before his death. According to David, Jessica had indeed encountered Carl Henderson on the night she disappeared. She had been walking along the shoulder of State Route 23 trying to get home after her argument with Tommy. Henderson, who knew her from his occasional stops at the Five and Dime, had pulled his truck over and offered her a ride. She had initially declined, but he had been persuasive, a familiar, trusted face in the darkness. What happened next was a tragedy born not of premeditation, but of senseless impulse. David recalled his father confessing that he'd been drinking earlier that evening, something unusual for him while working. The exact details of Jessica's death were lost in the fog of David's memory and his father's vague confessions. But it appeared to have been the result of a sudden, violent outburst in the cab of the truck, perhaps an argument, perhaps an unwanted advance that was rejected. Carl Henderson had strangled Jessica, and in a fit of panic, had hidden her body in a location that David either couldn't remember or had never been told. But he had kept her dress. He had taken her belongings, driven them 50 miles to his barn, cleaned them, and hidden them away a twisted, secret penance, or a monstrous trophy. Dad was never the same after that night, David told Santos during their final interview. He'd get quiet sometimes, real quiet. He'd say things about how one mistake could ruin everything. I never understood what he meant, not until now. The truth, after 36 years, had finally been unearthed. But knowledge is not the same as justice. And now, Detective Santos faced the hardest task of her career, delivering that brutal, incomplete truth to the man who had waited half a lifetime to hear it. There would be no trial. There would be no conviction. Carl Henderson had taken his case to the grave, cheating the legal system of its reckoning. In October of 2023, the case of Jessica Lynn Caldwell was officially closed, exceptionally cleared by the death of the perpetrator. It was an administrative resolution to a lifetime of pain. On a crisp September morning, Santos drove to the Caldwell farm. She found Robert Caldwell, now 81, sitting on his porch, his gaze fixed on the same fields where he had once searched for his daughter. He listened to Santos's explanation with the quiet, weathered dignity he had maintained for 3.5 decades. He listened to the story of Carl Henderson, the offered ride, the senseless act of violence, and the discovery in the barn. When she finished, he sat in silence for several long minutes, the only sound the rustling of the autumn leaves. Finally, he looked at her, his eyes clear and full of a pain that no amount of time could ever dull, and asked the only question that truly mattered. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Where's Jessica's body?" It was the cruelest part of the resolution. Santos had to tell him what the investigation had concluded. Carl Henderson had taken that secret to his grave. Despite extensive new searches of properties associated with the Henderson family, no trace of Jessica's remains had been discovered. The news of the case's resolution reached Tommy Brennan, now a man in his 50s living in another city. Those who knew him said it brought him a measure of peace, a quiet lifting of a shadow he had lived under since he was a boy. But for Robert Caldwell, the truth was a new kind of torture. He now knew the who and the how, but the where remained an open wound, denying his daughter the final dignity of a proper resting place. The mystery was solved, but the tragedy was far from over. The truth, once revealed, did not bring closure to Millbrook. It brought a contagion of distrust, a quiet poison that seeped into the town's collective soul, corrupting memories and fracturing its very identity. For 36 long years, the community's narrative of the tragedy had been built around a necessary fiction, a faceless phantom, a nameless drifter on the highway, a terrifying anomaly from the outside world. This story, while horrifying, was a form of psychological protection. It was a shield. It allowed the community to believe that the evil which had visited them was external, a random lightning strike from a distant storm, and that the inherent goodness of their small town, though violated, remained fundamentally intact. The revelation that the monster had a familiar face, a local name, a shared history, shattered that foundational myth with brutal, unforgiving force. Carl Henderson was not a phantom. He had been a neighbor, a customer at the local diner, a quiet man who was part of the town's unassuming fabric. He had bought gas at Murphy's. His children had attended the same schools. He was, in the most chilling way possible, one of them. This knowledge collapsed the safe distance between innocence and evil. Suddenly, the entire past of the town was rendered suspect, forced into a dark new context. In the vinyl booths of the Millbrook Diner, conversations now turned from crop prices to the nature of hidden evil. Old-timers, men who had known Carl for decades, now tried to recall their interactions with him, meticulously, obsessively, searching their memories for a hint of the darkness he had so perfectly concealed. Every casual nod exchanged over a hardware store counter, every brief conversation about the weather, every shared glance at a high school football game was now re-examined, tainted by the terrible knowledge of what he was capable of. A sickness of suspicion took root. If Carl Henderson could hide such a secret, who else in this quiet town was wearing a mask? The trust that had been the bedrock of Millbrook, already damaged in 1987, was now irrevocably pulverized. The horror was not that a monster had come to their town. It was the chilling, paralyzing realization that a monster had been living among them all along. This redefinition of the past rippled outward, finally bringing a painful, complex resolution to the lives that had been held in stasis by the mystery. For Amy Patterson, Jessica's best friend, the news was a seismic shock that compelled her to return from California, a pilgrimage she had avoided for years. She came back not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a solemn duty to the memory of the girl she knew. She spent a long weekend with Robert Caldwell, the two of them sitting in the quiet, sun-drenched living room, a space heavy with the ghosts of the past. For hours, they spoke, their conversation a gentle and heartbreaking archaeology of a lost life. They looked through old photo albums, the glossy images of a smiling, vibrant Jessica mocking the brutal finality of her fate. "Remember this?" Robert asked, his finger tracing a photo of the two girls, arms slung around each other, laughing in the high school cafeteria. "She'd just told me the most ridiculous joke," Amy recalled, a sad smile touching her lips. She had this laugh. It wasn't quiet. It filled up the whole room. She paused, her eyes welling with tears. For years, I felt so guilty. I wondered if I should have insisted on staying with her, if I should have known something was wrong. I played that night over and over. Robert looked at her, his gaze filled with a father's weary wisdom. That wasn't your burden to carry, Amy. The only one to blame is the man who did this. For Tommy Brennan, the resolution was a quiet, private absolution from a prison he never knew he was fully in until its walls dissolved. Now a man in his 50s, an architect living in Cincinnati. He had spent his entire adult life under a subtle, corrosive cloud of suspicion, though officially cleared decades ago. The whispers and the lingering questions had followed him like a shadow, shaping his choices, his relationships, his ability to ever truly move on. He read the news on his laptop, the headlines stark and unbelievable. He didn't feel elation or triumph. What he felt was a profound, hollowing release, followed by a final, crushing wave of grief for the girl he had loved. The official closing of the case was not a victory, but a quiet, somber peace, the end of a sentence he had never deserved. It was the lifting of a weight so old, so integrated into the fabric of his being, that he had almost forgotten he was still carrying it. As the town grappled with its fractured identity, the physical remnants of that night in 1987 took on a new, sacred weight. The midnight blue prom dress, now a key piece of evidence in Unsolved, albeit unprosecuted, homicide, was no longer just a garment. It was an artifact, a silent witness that had held its terrible secret in the dark for nearly 4 decades. It had been catalogued, photographed, and stored in the climate-controlled evidence locker of the BCI, its journey far from over. After the conclusion of all legal formalities, Robert Caldwell, in an act of profound grace and foresight, made a decision. He signed the paperwork to donate the dress to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation's historical archives. He knew it could never again be just a piece of clothing. It was now a part of Ohio's history. He hoped it would serve as a symbol, a testament to investigative persistence, and a beacon of hope for other families still lost in the suffocating fog of the unknown. Jessica always wanted to help people, Robert said in a rare interview, his voice steady. She wanted to be a teacher, to make a difference. Maybe her story, her dress, can still do that. Maybe it can help other families find the answers they're looking for. The most haunting legacy, however, remains at the Caldwell farm, a quiet monument to a love that endures. Jessica's bedroom is still unchanged. It is a time capsule of a future that never was. Posters of 80s rock bands are still tacked to the walls. A well-worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird lies on her nightstand. Her college acceptance letters from Ohio University sit on her desk. Their promises of a new life, new friends, and a new world of knowledge turned to ash. It is a museum of a life interrupted, a quiet, heartbreaking testament to a love that has refused to let go. A love that keeps a constant, unwavering vigil for a ghost. And then there is the final, lingering secret, the question that continues to echo in the Ohio fields. A question that represents the last, jagged piece of an incomplete puzzle. Where is she? The search for her remains continues, now more focused, more technologically advanced than ever before. Coordinated by Detective Santos and supported by volunteer search and rescue organizations like the Ohio Search and Recovery Team. Investigators use ground-penetrating radar and even cadaver dogs, hoping for a sign. They pore over Carl Henderson's old trucking logs, looking for any anomaly, any unexplained stop on his routes in the days following the murder. Each search is a painstaking act of hope against the crushing weight of time. A mission driven by the tireless dedication of strangers and a father's singular focus. Robert Caldwell, despite his advanced age, attends everyone. He walks the fields and forest edges, his eyes scanning the earth, a father on a final, sacred mission to bring his daughter home. This unending search is the ultimate legacy of the case, a testament to a love that will not fade, and a story that, until she is found, remains tragically, achingly incomplete. What then is the true measure of justice when the guilty party is beyond the reach of any earthly court? Can a truth discovered too late ever truly heal the wounds of the past? Or does it simply illuminate the full, horrifying depth of what was lost? The case of Jessica Lynn Caldwell stands as a somber, profound reflection on these questions. It is not a story of a brilliant detective solving a puzzle in a flash of insight. It is a story of slow, grinding persistence, of the methodical pace of science, and of a chance discovery that finally broke a 36-year silence. It reveals the terrifying banality of evil, not a diabolical mastermind lurking in the shadows, but a quiet, unremarkable man whose fleeting, violent impulse created a multi-generational wave of pain and suffering that continues to this day. It is a story that forces us to confront the stark, unbearable contrast between the vibrant, limitless potential of a young life and the senseless, brutal finality of its end. For decades, a community whispered about a faceless killer, a phantom on the highway, because that was a truth they could live with. The real truth that the killer had been one of their own was quieter, and somehow so much worse. It serves as an enduring, chilling warning that the deepest darkness can reside not in the shadows of a lonely road, but behind the familiar eyes of a neighbor, a friend, a person you see every day. The greatest monsters are often the ones who teach us, through their sheer normalcy, that they don't exist. And so, while the case file may be stamped closed, the search continues, driven by a father's undying love. This final, ongoing chapter is a reminder that for some, the search for truth is not about finding justice, but about finding peace. It is about reclaiming a name from a cold case file and giving her a final, dignified resting place. Until Jessica Lynn Caldwell is brought home, that peace remains just out of reach. A final, heartbreaking truth in a story that will forever haunt the quiet heartland of America.